The autumn sun streamed through the mall's skylight as Mrs. Thompson adjusted her son's collar one last time before his school presentation. Her 12-year-old boy was growing up so fast, already matching her height, his private school uniform crisp and neat. As they walked past the gleaming shop windows, she couldn't help but smile, remembering how hard she'd worked to give her children these opportunities. "Mom, can we grab a smoothie first?" her son asked, his eyes bright with excitement about his upcoming speech about space exploration. They had arrived early to pick up some last-minute supplies for his presentation board, and there was plenty of time to spare. "Of course, sweetheart," she replied, her heart warming at his enthusiasm. Mrs. Thompson had always encouraged both her children to dream big, teaching them that their possibilities were limitless. As a corporate attorney, she'd shown them through example that hard work and determination could open doors. They were heading toward the food court when she noticed two security guards talking into their radios, their eyes fixed in their direction. Her stomach tightened. She knew that look all too well. Years of experience had taught her to read these situations, but she pushed down her rising anxiety, hoping she was wrong. Her son was chattering about NASA's latest Mars mission when the guards approached. "Excuse me, young man," the taller guard said, his hand resting too casually on his belt. "We need you to come with us." Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her professional instincts kicking in. "Is there a problem, officers?" Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. "Ma'am, we received a report about a young man in a blue jacket shoplifting from Sterling's Electronics," the second guard explained, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "He matches the description." Her son's face crumpled in confusion. "But I didn't," he started, his voice small and uncertain. "My son has been with me the entire time," Mrs. Thompson stated firmly. "We just arrived at the mall. He's wearing his school uniform and is preparing for a presentation today." The guards exchanged glances. "We still need to check his backpack and bring him to the security office. It's standard procedure." Mrs. Thompson watched helplessly as her son's shoulders slumped, the pride in his uniform visibly draining away. Other shoppers slowed their pace, some openly staring, others quickly averting their eyes. Her daughter, trailing behind them, clutched her phone tightly, her small fingers trembling. "I want to see the security footage," Mrs. Thompson demanded, her lawyer's mind already cataloging every detail of this interaction. "And I need your badge numbers and supervisor's contact information." The next 30 minutes unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare. In the sterile security office, they reviewed camera footage that showed a completely different person in a similar colored jacket. The suspect was clearly not a child in a school uniform, but the damage was already done. Her son sat quietly in the corner chair, his presentation materials scattered across the table where they'd been dumped out for inspection. His eyes were fixed on the floor, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Mrs. Thompson recognized this pose. It was one she'd never wanted to see in her child. It was the look of someone being taught to make themselves smaller, less noticeable, less threatening. When they finally left the security office, her son's smoothie forgotten, Mrs. Thompson noticed how he walked differently. His shoulders were hunched, his steps hurried, as if trying to disappear. The space-loving boy who'd bounded into the mall talking about Mars missions was now silent, his dreams momentarily overshadowed by this harsh reality. In the car, she tried to start a conversation. "Baby, what happened in there? It wasn't right. It wasn't about you or anything you did." "I know, Mom," he whispered, but his eyes remained fixed on his hands. "Can we just go home? I don't feel like giving my presentation anymore." Those words shattered something inside her. This was the moment every black parent dreaded, when their child first truly understood that the world might see them differently, judge them unfairly, fear them without cause. But Mrs. Thompson refused to let this break her son's spirit. She pulled into a nearby park instead of heading home. "Let's practice your presentation here first," she suggested gently. "Just you and me." As they sat on a bench, surrounded by falling autumn leaves, she listened to him talk about space, about dreams of becoming an astronaut, about the infinite possibilities that lay beyond Earth's atmosphere. Slowly, his voice grew stronger, his gestures more animated. Mrs. Thompson watched her boy emerge again from behind the shadow of what had happened. But something had changed within her too. As she drove home later that afternoon, after her son had given his presentation and earned top marks, Mrs. Thompson knew this incident wouldn't end here. The security guard's badges numbers were safely stored in her phone, along with recordings and notes from the entire interaction. That evening, as she tucked her kids into bed, she made a silent promise. This wouldn't just be another story for her children to carry, another weight for them to bear. This time, she would use every resource at her disposal, her legal training, her professional connections, her voice, to create real change. As she sat in her home office late into the night, researching similar incidents and drafting emails to civil rights organizations, Mrs. Thompson felt a new sense of purpose. Her children would grow up in a world that recognized their brilliance, their dignity, their humanity. And she would make sure of it, one step at a time. The changes were subtle at first, like shadows growing longer as the sun sets. Mrs. Thompson noticed how her son's morning routine had shifted. Instead of racing to get dressed for school, he now spent extra time studying his reflection, adjusting and readjusting his uniform as if trying to make it perfect, or perhaps trying to make himself beyond reproach. During breakfast, while her daughter happily chatted about her art class project, Mrs. Thompson watched her son push his cereal around the bowl, his usual appetite for both food and conversation diminished. When she suggested stopping by the grocery store after school, he quietly asked if they could just go home instead. "I have a lot of homework," he explained, not meeting her eyes. But Mrs. Thompson knew her son's schedule by heart. It was a light homework day. The mall incident had planted seeds of doubt in places where confidence once grew. Her bright, curious boy, who used to pepper her with questions about everything from black holes to butterflies, was becoming quieter, more careful with his words and movements. One evening, while helping her daughter with math homework, the young girl looked up suddenly. "Mom, why did those guards think brother was bad? He's the nicest person I know." The question hung in the air like heavy storm clouds. Mrs. Thompson put down the pencil she'd been holding and drew her daughter close. "Sometimes people make wrong assumptions based on how someone looks," she explained carefully. "But that says more about them than it does about your brother or anyone else they judge unfairly." Her daughter frowned, processing this information with the pure logic of a child. "But that's stupid," she declared. "You can't know if someone's good or bad just by looking at them." From the doorway came a soft sound. Her son had been listening. He stood there in his space-themed pajamas, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had in weeks. Mrs. Thompson opened her other arm, and he joined their huddle, his usual teenage resistance to family hugs temporarily forgotten. That night, after the kids were asleep, Mrs. Thompson sat in her home office, surrounded by case files from her corporate law practice. But her mind kept drifting to a different kind of case altogether. She opened her laptop and began researching similar incidents at the same mall. As a lawyer, she knew the power of patterns, of documented evidence, of voices joined together to demand change. Her research led her down a rabbit hole of social media posts, community forums, and local news articles. Other parents had shared similar stories, young people profiled, detained, humiliated. Some incidents had made the news, others had been buried under shame and resignation. Many families had simply decided to shop elsewhere, to tell their children to keep their hands visible, to never run or laugh too loudly in public spaces. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson was preparing for court when her son appeared in her bedroom doorway, already dressed for school but hesitating to leave. "Mom," he said quietly, "do you think I should quit the science club?" The words hit her like a physical blow. The science club was his favorite activity, the place where he shone brightest. "It meets at the community center now, and sometimes we have to walk through the shopping district to get there." She crossed the room and knelt before him, her court documents forgotten. "No, sweetheart, you're not going to quit anything. We're going to change things instead." That afternoon, between client meetings, Mrs. Thompson made some calls. She reached out to other parents from her son's school, then branched out to neighboring districts. She created a private social media group where families could share their experiences and support each other. With each new story, her determination grew stronger. Her children watched her with curiosity as she spent evenings on video calls, taking notes, building connections. Her daughter started creating artwork about equality and kindness, covering their refrigerator with colorful drawings of people holding hands, of hearts in all shades of brown and black and white. Her son gradually began to emerge from his shell again, especially after Mrs. Thompson arranged for a retired black astronaut to speak to his science club. Watching him ask questions about space missions and training programs, his eyes shining with renewed passion, she felt both pride and purpose surge through her. One night, as she tucked her daughter into bed, the little girl asked, "Mom, are you going to fight the bad people?" Mrs. Thompson smoothed her daughter's hair back. "No, honey, I'm going to help them learn to be better people. Sometimes that's the harder fight, but it's the one worth having." Later, reviewing security footage and witness statements from other families, Mrs. Thompson realized that this wasn't just about one incident or one family anymore. It was about creating a world where her children, and all children, could walk through public spaces without their hearts racing, could wear any clothing without fear of judgment, could simply be kids without carrying the weight of others' prejudices. As she drafted emails to civil rights organizations and community leaders, Mrs. Thompson felt the lawyer in her merging with the mother in her, creating something powerful and unstoppable. This was more than a case now. It was a cause, a movement, a promise to her children that change was possible, and it would begin with them. The steady hum of Mrs. Thompson's office printer filled the late-night silence as she organized another stack of incident reports. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Each new document she uncovered felt like finding another piece of a disturbing puzzle, one that showed a clear pattern at the mall where her son had been wrongfully detained. Just one more hour, she whispered to herself, the same thing she'd said 3 hours ago. Her laptop screen glowed with dozens of open tabs, community forums, local news archives, and social media posts. The stories kept coming. An honor-roll student accused of stealing while buying school supplies, a young athlete questioned for loitering while waiting for his mom, a Girl Scout stopped for suspicious behavior while selling cookies with her troop. Her phone buzzed with a message from another parent. "Are you still up?" Just found another incident from last summer, sending details now. The support network she'd started had grown beyond her expectations. What began as a few concerned parents sharing stories over coffee had evolved into a structured group of families documenting their experiences. They met weekly in the community center, their children playing together while adults shared their stories, some speaking up for the first time about incidents they'd tried to forget. During one such meeting, a soft-spoken father stood up, his hands slightly shaking as he held a piece of paper. "My boy used to love photography," he said, "had his camera with him everywhere. Then one day, security accused him of taking suspicious pictures at the mall. They deleted everything on his camera. He hasn't picked it up since." Mrs. Thompson watched her own son, sitting in the corner with other kids, helping them with science homework. The light was slowly coming back to his eyes, especially when he was explaining complex space concepts to his peers. But she still caught him checking over his shoulder in public spaces, still noticed how he kept his hands visible when entering stores. During her lunch breaks at the law firm, she researched similar cases across the country. Her legal pad filled with notes about precedents, settlements, and policy changes. Her colleagues noticed her intensity, some offering help, others keeping their distance. One senior partner pulled her aside after a meeting. "I hear you're building a civil rights case," he said carefully. "Just be prepared. These things can get messy." But Mrs. Thompson was prepared. She'd started therapy sessions for both her children, creating a safe space for them to process their feelings. Her daughter's art teacher had noticed a change in her drawings. They now often featured people standing up to bullies, helping each other, making things right. One evening, while reviewing security footage from various incidents, their son wandered into her home office. He watched the screens silently for a moment, then asked, "Mom, do you think anything will really change?" She turned to face him fully. "Change happens step by step, sweetheart. Sometimes it's slow, but it's already happening. Look at all these families sharing their stories, supporting each other. That's the first step." He nodded thoughtfully. "Some kids at school heard about what you're doing. They asked if their parents could come to the next meeting." The group continued to grow. Mrs. Thompson organized the evidence methodically: photographs, video footage, witness statements, social media posts. She created a timeline of incidents stretching back 5 years. Patterns emerged. Certain security guards appeared multiple times. Specific store locations had higher incident rates. Particular times of day showed increased profiling. Working with a civil rights organization, she helped develop a survey for mall visitors, gathering data about their experiences. The results were eye-opening. It wasn't just about security incidents, it was about following customers through stores, ignoring them when they needed assistance, making them feel unwelcome in subtle but constant ways. Late one night, as she reviewed testimonies from affected families, her daughter padded into the office in her pajamas. "Mommy, you're still working." Mrs. Thompson smiled tiredly. "Just finishing up, baby. Did you need something?" Her daughter climbed into her lap, looking at the papers spread across the desk. "I drew something for your case," she said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. It showed a diverse group of people shopping together, smiling, helping each other. At the top, in careful letters, she'd written, "Everyone belongs here." Mrs. Thompson pinned the drawing above her desk, right next to her law degree. It reminded her daily of what this fight was really about, not just legal victories, but creating spaces where every child could feel safe, welcomed, and valued. The case was building momentum. Other attorneys offered their expertise, community leaders voiced their support, and local media began asking questions. But Mrs. Thompson's proudest moment came when her son's science club chose creating inclusive spaces as their next project theme, combining their love of data analysis with social justice. "We're going to study human behavior patterns," he explained excitedly over dinner, "using scientific methods to track and document different treatments. It's like a real research project." As she prepared for the first major meeting with the mall's corporate lawyers, Mrs. Thompson reflected on how far they'd come. What started as a mother's determination to protect her children had grown into a community-wide movement for change. The evidence was overwhelming, the stories powerful, and the determination unshakable. "Remember," she told the group of parents gathered for preparation, "we're not just fighting against something. We're fighting for something. For our children's right to exist in public spaces without fear, to be treated with dignity, to simply be kids. That's worth every late night, every difficult conversation, every step of this journey." The first sign of pushback came on a quiet Tuesday morning. Mrs. Thompson was preparing for court when she opened her work email and found dozens of messages from unknown senders. Some questioned her motives, others suggested she was creating problems where none existed. A few tried to paint her as an opportunist seeking attention. She took a deep breath, saved the emails as evidence, and continued with her day. But by afternoon, the resistance had grown more organized. The mall's parent company released a statement defending their security practices, carefully worded to imply that her son's detention had been justified by reasonable suspicion. "Mom, why are some people at school acting weird?" her son asked that evening during dinner. He pushed his food around his plate, something he'd started doing again recently. "My teacher kept asking if I was okay, but in a strange way, and some kids' parents told them not to partner with me for projects." Her heart ached, but her voice remained steady. "Some people get uncomfortable when others stand up for what's right, but that doesn't mean we stop standing." Her daughter looked up from her homework. "My art teacher said I can't display my new paintings in the school hallway. She said they're too political." The paintings had simply shown children of different colors playing together at a mall. That night, after the kids were asleep, Mrs. Thompson noticed a car driving slowly past their house for the third time. She documented it, just like she documented everything now. The next morning, she installed security cameras around their home, not out of fear, but out of prudence. At work, the atmosphere had shifted. Colleagues who once stopped by her office to chat now hurried past with quick nods. In a partners meeting, someone suggested that her personal crusade might make some clients uncomfortable. They didn't directly ask her to stop, but the message was clear. "Perhaps you could pursue this more quietly." One partner suggested, his tone carefully neutral. "Think about your career trajectory." Mrs. Thompson straightened her spine, channeling the strength she wanted her children to see. "I am thinking about trajectories," she replied. "The trajectory of change. The trajectory of justice. Those matter more than career paths." The resistance took new forms each day. The mall hired a PR firm that began highlighting their community involvement and diversity initiatives. Local business groups suggested that increased security was necessary for everyone's safety. Some media outlets painted the families speaking out as troublemakers seeking financial gain. But for every attempt to discredit them, support grew stronger. When her son's science club was suddenly told they couldn't use the mall's common area for their Inclusive Spaces project, 3 other businesses offered their locations instead. When some parents pulled their kids from a club, twice as many new students joined. Her daughter came home one day beaming. "My friend's mom is a reporter," she announced. "She wants to help tell our story the right way." The mall's corporate office tried a different approach, offering a private settlement with a confidentiality clause. The amount was substantial, enough to pay for both children's college education, but it came with a catch. They would have to stop their advocacy work immediately. Mrs. Thompson gathered her family for a discussion. "This affects all of us," she explained. "We need to decide together." Her son spoke first, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "If we take it, nothing changes for other kids, right?" When she nodded, he continued, "Then I don't want it." Her daughter added, "My art teacher said sometimes being brave means saying no to easy things to do the right thing instead." That evening, as Mrs. Thompson drafted their formal rejection of the settlement, she found anonymous notes of support in her work mailbox. Other lawyers offered to help pro bono. Parents from different neighborhoods reached out with their own stories. A pattern of solidarity emerged, stronger than the pattern of intimidation. The resistance took a toll, though. She noticed her son checking their new security cameras before heading out to catch the school bus. Her daughter asked why they couldn't go to their favorite ice cream shop anymore. The owner had made it clear they weren't welcome after joining the mall's business association. But there were unexpected moments of joy, too. The local library invited her daughter to display her artwork in their children's section. Her son's science club presentation on inclusive spaces was selected for a regional competition. Community members they'd never met dropped off groceries, offered rides for the kids, or simply stopped by to say, "Keep going." During one particularly tough week, when the mall's lawyers had filed multiple motions to dismiss their case, Mrs. Thompson found a handmade card on her desk. Inside were dozens of signatures from other parents and their children, each with a message of support. "You taught us to use our voices," one read. "Now we're all speaking together." That night, looking at her sleeping children, Mrs. Thompson reflected on how this fight had changed them all. Her son walked taller now, not out of defiance but with renewed confidence. Her daughter's art had evolved from simple scenes of harmony to powerful statements about courage and community. "Maybe," she whispered to herself, "this resistance is actually making us stronger." The next morning, as they drove past the mall on their way to school, her son pointed out something new. Other parents and their children standing outside with signs supporting their cause. The resistance had tried to isolate them, but instead, it had helped build a stronger community. "Look, Mom," her daughter said, pressing her hand against the car window. "We're not alone anymore." Mrs. Thompson smiled, remembering something her grandmother used to say. "When you're on the right path, obstacles don't block you. They show you how many people are ready to help you climb over them." Spring had arrived, bringing with it unexpected growth, not just in the flowers pushing through the soil, but in the movement that had taken root in their community. Mrs. Thompson stood at the community center's podium, looking out at the crowd that had gathered for their weekly meeting. What had started as a small group of concerned parents had blossomed into something remarkable. "6 months ago, my son was wrongfully detained at the mall," she began, her voice clear and strong. "Today, we're not just telling our stories, we're changing them." The room was packed with families from all corners of the city. Children sat cross-legged on the floor, drawing pictures and working on homework, while their parents shared experiences and planned actions. In the back, local civil rights leaders chatted with small business owners who had offered their spaces for meetings and events. Her son had found his voice again, but in a new way. He and his science club friends had created a presentation about the psychology of bias using data they'd collected from their community surveys. They were teaching it at other schools now, their young voices carrying messages of change to their peers. "We interviewed over 300 people," he explained to a reporter from the local news station. "The data shows clear patterns of unfair treatment, but it also shows how simple changes can make a big difference." His confidence had returned, stronger now because it was built on purpose rather than just passion. Her daughter's art had become the movement's visual voice. Her paintings and drawings appeared on flyers and social media posts, telling their story in colors and shapes that spoke to both children and adults. The local art gallery had even offered to host an exhibition titled Through Children's Eyes, A Community's Journey. "Your daughter's work really captures the heart of this," the gallery owner had said. "It's not just about what's wrong, it's about how things could be right." The peaceful protests they organized outside the mall had evolved into community education events. Instead of just carrying signs, they set up information booths, held workshops on knowing your rights, and created spaces for dialogue. Local teachers volunteered to run activities for children, turning protest days into opportunities for learning and connection. One Saturday morning, an elderly woman approached Mrs. Thompson at one of these events. "I've been shopping at this mall for 40 years, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Never said a word when I saw things that weren't right. But watching you and these young people, you've taught this old lady how to speak up." The movement had found unexpected allies. A group of retail workers from the mall had started documenting discriminatory policies they'd been asked to enforce. Small business owners shared stories of being pressured to support the mall's aggressive security measures. Even some former security guards came forward with their concerns about the training they'd received. Mrs. Thompson's daughter had started a lunch club at her school called Friendship First. Children who might never have sat together were now sharing tables, trading snacks, and learning about each other's lives. When asked why she started it, she simply said, "Because everyone needs a place where they can just be themselves." The local library had become their unofficial headquarters, offering meeting spaces and resources. The children's librarian helped kids create a wall of dreams, a collection of essays and artwork about the community they wanted to build. "It's not just about what we're against," she explained. "It's about what we're for." Social media had amplified their message beyond their city limits. Other communities reached out, sharing similar stories and asking for advice on starting their own movements. Mrs. Thompson spent evening hours on video calls, guiding other parents through the process of documenting incidents and building support networks. Her son's science club had expanded their project, creating an app that helped people report and track incidents of discrimination. "But we also track the good things," he insisted, "like which stores make everyone feel welcome and where people help each other." The movement was changing the way people saw themselves and their role in the community. Parents who had once stayed silent began speaking at school board meetings. Children who had felt invisible were finding their voices through art, writing, and activism. During one community forum, a young boy raised his hand. "My mom says you're teaching us how to be brave," he said to Mrs. Thompson. "Is it scary to be brave?" She thought carefully before answering. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going anyway, especially when you're doing it for others." The local news had started covering their story differently too. Instead of focusing on controversy, they highlighted the positive changes: businesses adopting new training programs, security companies revising their policies, schools implementing anti-bias curriculum. One evening, as Mrs. Thompson helped clean up after a community meeting, she found a stack of letters from children. They had drawn pictures of themselves feeling safe and happy at the mall, playing with friends of all backgrounds. One letter simply said, "Thank you for making space for all of us." Her own children had grown in ways she hadn't expected. Her son had discovered a talent for public speaking, breaking down complex issues into terms other kids could understand. Her daughter's art was becoming more nuanced, showing both the challenges they faced and the hope they carried. As she drove home that night, past the mall where it all began, Mrs. Thompson noticed something different. The lights inside showed people of all backgrounds shopping, laughing, simply being. Change was happening, not in dramatic bursts, but in quiet, persistent waves of understanding and action. "Mom," her daughter said from the backseat, "I think we're making the world bigger." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Well, before, some people tried to make our world smaller. But now we're making it big enough for everyone." Mrs. Thompson smiled in the rearview mirror at her children. They were right. This wasn't just about changing policies or practices. It was about expanding the circle of belonging, one heart at a time. The courthouse steps were crowded that morning. Mrs. Thompson adjusted her son's tie. He'd insisted on wearing one today, and held her daughter's hand as they made their way through the gathering of supporters. People who had stood with them through months of struggle were there, holding signs and offering encouraging smiles. Inside the courtroom, Mrs. Thompson sat straight-backed and focused, her legal training merging with her mother's heart as she prepared for the final phase of their journey. Her children sat in the front row with their aunt, their presence reminding her of exactly why this fight mattered. The mole's corporate lawyers arrived with stacks of documents and practiced arguments about security protocols and reasonable suspicion. But Mrs. Thompson had something more powerful. She had the truth, captured in hundreds of testimonies, backed by data, and illuminated by the voices of children who had learned too early about unfair treatment. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "this case isn't just about one incident or one family. It's about a pattern of behavior that has turned a public space into a place of fear for too many of our children." She presented their evidence methodically. Security footage showing discriminatory practices, testimony from former employees about bias training, statistics revealing disturbing patterns in who was stopped, questioned, and detained. But it was the personal stories that filled the courtroom with an undeniable energy. The judge listened intently as Mrs. Thompson shared how her son had stopped wearing his beloved science club t-shirts to the mall, choosing instead to always wear his school uniform because it makes me look more official. She described how her daughter had started asking if they could shop online instead, because the internet doesn't care what color we are. During a break in proceedings, her son tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, when you were talking about the science club project," the judge was nodding. "I think he understands." Her daughter had filled 3 sketchbooks with drawings during the trial, each one capturing moments in the courtroom. The determined faces of community members testifying, the supportive hands on shoulders, the way people leaned forward to listen to each other's stories. The mole's lawyers presented their defense, arguing that their security measures were standard practice, that any disparities were unintentional, that change would be too costly and complicated. But Mrs. Thompson was ready. She called forward small business owners who had already implemented new training programs, showing how simple changes had improved both security and customer relationships. She presented research from other cities where similar changes had actually increased profits by making shopping centers more welcoming to everyone. The cost of change, she argued, is far less than the cost of continuing to harm our children's sense of worth and belonging. As the trial progressed, something unexpected happened. The local media coverage sparked a national conversation. Other malls and shopping centers across the country began reaching out, asking for guidance on reviewing their own practices. Mrs. Thompson's phone filled with messages from parents in other cities, sharing similar stories and asking for advice. Her son's science club presentation on bias and security practices was being adapted into a training module for retail workers. Her daughter's artwork was being featured in a national magazine's article about youth activism. Their family stand was inspiring others to look more closely at the spaces in their own communities. The day the judge announced his decision, the courthouse was packed. Mrs. Thompson felt her children's hands slip into hers as they all stood to hear the ruling. The judge's words were clear and decisive. The mall would be required to implement comprehensive anti-bias training, revise its security protocols, and establish a community oversight board. But he went further, praising the constructive approach the families had taken. "This case shows us that seeking justice doesn't have to mean seeking punishment," he said. "It can mean creating opportunities for education, understanding, and genuine change." The settlement included funding for ongoing training programs and community initiatives. The oversight board would include young people, ensuring that their perspectives would continue to shape policies. The mall would become a model for other retail spaces, showing how inclusivity could strengthen both business and community. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by celebrating supporters, Mrs. Thompson hugged her children close. Her son was already talking excitedly about joining the Youth Advisory Committee for the Oversight Board. Her daughter was sharing her latest drawings with a group of younger children, showing them how art could help tell important stories. That evening, they hosted a community dinner at their local church. People brought dishes to share, children played together, and adults who had once been strangers now embraced like family. The conversation wasn't about winning or losing, it was about what came next, about how they could help other communities create similar changes. "Mom," her son said as they were cleaning up afterward, "remember when you said change happens step by step? I think we just took a really big step." Her daughter added, "And we helped other people learn how to step too." Later that night, as Mrs. Thompson looked through the messages pouring in from across the country, she realized that their victory wasn't just in the legal decision. It was in the way the community had come together, in how her children had grown stronger instead of fearful, in how one family's stand for justice had opened doors for many others. She opened her laptop to start drafting guidelines for other communities, knowing that their work wasn't ending, it was transforming. As she typed, she could hear her children in the next room, planning their next projects, their voices full of the confidence that comes from knowing you can make a difference. 5 years had passed since that first incident at the mall. Mrs. Thompson stood in the back of the auditorium, watching her son deliver the opening speech at a national youth leadership conference. He'd grown taller than her now, his voice deeper, but his eyes still lit up the same way when he talked about making a difference. "When I was 12, he told the packed audience, one incident changed our lives. But it wasn't the incident itself that mattered most, it was what we chose to do about it." The mall where it all began had transformed. The security guards now went through monthly training sessions that her son's youth committee helped design. Children of all backgrounds played in the central courtyard where art from local schools, including her daughter's pieces, rotated on display. The Community Oversight Board had become a model for retail spaces across the country. Her daughter, now in high school, had started an arts program that brought together young people to share their stories through creativity. Her latest exhibition, titled 5 Years Forward, showed the journey their community had taken, not just in changes to policies and practices, but in the way people treated each other. "Mom, look what I found," her daughter said one afternoon, pulling out an old sketchbook. The pages were filled with drawings from the early days of their struggle, the courthouse, the community meetings, the protests. But now, next to each old drawing, she'd created a new one showing how things had changed. Mrs. Thompson's law practice had evolved too. She'd started a nonprofit organization that helped other communities address similar issues. Her office walls were covered with letters from families across the country who'd used their example to create change in their own neighborhoods. One letter stood out: "My daughter can now walk through our local mall without her shoulders tensing. She says it's because of the work your family started. Thank you for showing us how to make space for everyone." The changes had rippled out in unexpected ways. Other businesses had adopted the training programs they developed. Schools used their story in social studies classes to teach about community activism and peaceful change. The local police department had even invited their youth advisory board to help revise their community engagement policies. Her son's science club project had grown into a national database tracking both problems and progress in retail spaces. "It's important to document both," he always said during presentations. "The problems show us what needs to change, but the progress shows us change is possible." One Saturday morning, Mrs. Thompson walked through the mall with both her children. They were there to help train a new group of youth advisors, but they'd arrived early to grab breakfast at the cafe where they'd once planned to get smoothies all those years ago. "Remember when we couldn't even walk in here without feeling scared?" her daughter asked, sketching the scene of families shopping, children playing, security guards chatting warmly with visitors. Her son nodded, typing notes on his tablet for the training session. "Now we're teaching others how to make every space feel this way." The training session that morning was full of young people from neighboring cities, eager to learn how to create similar changes in their own communities. Mrs. Thompson watched as her children led activities, shared stories, and answered questions. They'd grown into leaders, but more importantly, they'd grown into themselves, confident, compassionate, and committed to helping others. During a break, a young girl approached Mrs. Thompson. "My mom says before you guys, nobody thought things could change. How did you know it was possible?" Mrs. Thompson smiled, remembering all the late nights, the tough conversations, the moments of doubt. "We didn't know it was possible," she answered honestly. "We just knew it was necessary." That evening, they hosted a community dinner celebrating 5 years of progress. The room was filled with familiar faces, people who'd stood with them from the beginning, new allies who joined along the way, and young people who were carrying the work forward. Her daughter had created a timeline on one wall, mixing photographs with her artwork to show their journey. "Look how far we've come," people kept saying as they studied it. But Mrs. Thompson noticed they spent even more time looking at her daughter's newest pieces, the ones showing where they could go next. Her son gave a presentation about their latest initiative, a mentorship program pairing high school students with younger kids to help them find their voices early. Change isn't just about fixing problems, he explained. It's about building something better together. As Mrs. Thompson looked around the room, she saw how their family's stand had helped create not just policy changes, but a new way of being community. Children who might never have met were now best friends. Adults who might have passed each other without a word now worked together on community projects. Later that night, as they were driving home, her daughter asked, "Mom, do you ever wish that day at the mall never happened?" Mrs. Thompson thought carefully before answering. That day showed us something was wrong, but it also showed us we could make it right. Sometimes the hardest moments lead us to the most important changes. Her son added from the backseat, "And we're not done yet. There's still so much more we can do." They pulled into their driveway, where the security cameras they'd once installed out of necessity now captured images of neighborhood children playing together, community meetings on their front porch, and daily moments of connection that proved change wasn't just possible, it was happening, one relationship at a time. "You know what the best part is?" her daughter said as they walked inside. "Now when little kids come to the mall, they don't have to learn about unfairness. They get to learn about community instead." Mrs. Thompson hugged her children close, grateful for how far they'd come and excited about where they were going next. Their story hadn't ended with a legal victory or policy changes. It lived on in every person who now knew they had the power to stand up, speak out, and create the change they wanted to see.